Okay, thank you very much. Lisa, let me give you the cues, verbal cues for the slides. That's okay, leave that one up there. Yes, this talk is about spiritual democracy, but it's not about politics at all. Spiritual democracy is fundamentally cultural and psychological, hence a Jungian-Gebserian perspective on democracy and its shadow. And I'm going to reference these books that I have listed here. But let me give you, by way of an introduction, to say one of the fundamental processes of education is to nurture the present and the future in our children. And the presence of the future was the theme of last year's conference, and I spoke on this same subject. But currently, what we have, and these are the higher philosophical and intellectual ideas that govern education and govern the society. Currently, a dystopian, secular, techno-modernist vision dominates the vision of the future that we are cultivating in our children. And this is opposed by conservative religious nationalism, which is currently becoming very strong in the United States. Spiritual democracy is grounded in Gebser's cultural vision of integrality and Jung's psychological individuation imperative. However, Jung's solipsistic model of the individuation in the second half of life must change. And in this regard, I have proposed elsewhere that the individuation imperative must be refocused on what I call developmental individuation that merges Erich Neumann's vision of individuation, which he called central version, with Gebser's 5 structures of consciousness. As we will soon see, this new concept of psychological individuation is fundamental to the concept of spiritual democracy, but I am not going to talk about developmental individuation here. What you see here is that the 3 main references that I'm going to use for this talk, they are books by Stephen Herman. The first one is called Walt Whitman, Shamanism, Spiritual Democracy, and the World's Soul. Spiritual Democracy, the Wisdom of the Early American Visionaries for the Journey Forward, and William James and C.G. Jung, Doorways to the Self. There's a 4th book in this series, which is Emily Dickinson, A Medicine Woman for Our Time, but I'm not going to talk about that book. When we talk about these books, or when we talk about this sequence that Stephen Herman has presented for us about how spiritual democracy has evolved in the American consciousness. It's something that is inborn now in the American DNA. I would say it's been around for 200 years. But he begins with the concept of shamanism. We have the next slide. Lisa, yeah. So I wrote about shamanism and individuation and the culture of democracy in this essay in academia. It's posted on Academia EDU. Individuation and the culture of democracy. Jung knew that active imagination would ultimately lead to the numinous experiences, that is, shamanic experiences. And that was the ultimate goal of his psychology. But Herman says that Whitman, on the other hand, was operating closer to the source, closer to the trunk of the tree of shamanism itself. And that became evident in the fact that Walt Whitman went through a shamanistic initiation. The mask of the mana personality, which is the vocation or the vocational archetype, stands between the ego and the shamanic archetype that underlies it. And part of this mask in the United States, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier this morning, part of this mask looks to Europe for its values, energy, and forms, while the other part looks to the values, forms, and energies of the Native American cultural unconscious. So this is the balance that Herman is talking about. And he calls these particular poets the American shamanic poets because they took the Christian Dionysian shamanistic energy from Europe, or the elements of shamanism from Europe, and took them to a deeper indigenous level through their devotion to the Native American muses. So Walt Whitman went through his first 10 chapters of the first book. Walt Whitman talk about this shamanic initiation. Whitman went through his shamanic initiation between 1847 and 1860 at the age of 28 to 40. And he wrote about that in Leaves of Grass, which was published in 1860. So Herman calls this an archetypal autobiography. It weaves together moments of a life that expose archetypal experiences with the concurrent transformations of the personality. And Herman attributes this to Herman Melville's Moby Dick and to Emily Dickinson's collected works as well. So these are the three American shamanic poets: Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, and Emily Dickinson. Whitman was undaunted in his efforts to lead the people toward a new spiritual realization in America, that is, to pave the way toward a new vision of democracy in which every person might participate in the experience of the self in the world's future, that is, nurturing the presence of that future in our children. And that brings us to the concept of the shaman, the three aspects of the personality. There is the ego persona, which faces the world, and there is the mana personality, which is the vocational archetype, which stands in the middle. And the mana personality is the personality that expresses the spiritual power of the individual in terms of its authority, in terms of its character and personality. That's how it's expressed. That is the mana personality, and the archetype of the shaman stands behind that vocational archetype. So let's go on to the next slide. The next slide connects this with this concept of individuation, with democracy. And Murray Stein, who is an important contemporary Jungian, in his book, The Principle of Individuation, says this, and he doesn't mention democracy, but we can see democracy written in this paragraph. The space of individuation or integrality is complex, even paradoxical. It involves a conscious awareness of the intertwining of psyche and world, and it embraces lived experiences as symbolic through and through, and it rests on the recognition of a specifically psychological world in which there is room to play and to carry out the operations of individuation. So there is, in fact, a wonderful comparison between Neumann's central version and Gebser's integrality that I further developed in my talk on developmental individuation. But it shows you how Gebser's integrality is, in fact, an individuation experience, or in the same sense as an individuation experience, in that both look at the inward processes, going back into the psyche, to the inward process that begins in adulthood, to individuate and by integrating all of the earlier structures of consciousness. So in effect, we must all reorient our consciousness from what Gebser called the deficient mode of mental consciousness toward integral consciousness, or in Jungian terms, a fully individuated personality. So let us examine some of these this deficient mode of mental consciousness. We can go on to the next slide. Walt Whitman, in 1871, published an essay called Democratic Vistas, and in Democratic Vistas, he outlined three phases of democracy. Democracy evolves in the constitutional political phase, the socioeconomic phase, and then into the spiritual phase. So first, the constitutional and democratic manifestation of democracy in the United States had its first test with the Civil War of the 1860s. And it survived that test. So it went into the socio and economic phase. Now, Whitman, coming from a more pastoral background, could well have imagined that this socioeconomic phase of democracy would have been characterized by small villages or small towns of Native Americans, European Americans, and African Americans all living together in harmony and being good stewards over the land that took care of their economic situation, either farmland or ranches or mountains or seashore or forests. And that natural resource created enough economic stability for everybody. But of course, what happened was that the corporate barons came in and bought up all the resources. So what happened with that is that, I mean, we see that today in our technological society. And what happened was that there was a backlash against this industrialization, or maybe not a backlash, but a trying to understand it. It was a philosophical and intellectual movement that arose in the late 1800s called modernism. And this is one of the shadows, or part of the shadow of spiritual democracy, or the deficient mode of mental consciousness. Modernism arose as a search for sane and salient understanding of the self, society, of the world in a period of great instability, beginning in the 1890s and becoming prominent after World War I. This great instability was instigated by the introduction of new technologies in factories and transportation, and the development of the electric grid, in military technology, in graphic and photo technology, and in the promise of revolutions against colonialism and capitalism. Those promises were perhaps a bit too optimistic. So in the 1960s, what arose was the concept of modernism, which we're still mired in today. The leading proponent of postmodernism was the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. And Derrida's concept of critical thinking became a fundamental intellectual exercise of postmodernist thinking, now greatly emphasized in the K through 12 education system. Critical thinking was aimed at what Derrida called the deconstruction of the cultural canon. And the deconstruction of the cultural canon has led to a break between an individual and their cultural identity. So there's a retribalization going on now. And a common culturally guided moral and ethical compass. See how some of this degeneration took place. The deconstruction of the American cultural canon and moral compass began as an opposition to the puritanical attitudes and behaviors that still lingered into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Then during the Clinton era in the 1990s, that moral compass evolved, pointing toward political correctness, which simply means virtue and morality no longer guided by a cultural spiritual compass, but rather guided by common socialized behavioral standards that merged postmodernism with the concept of secular humanism. It arose in the 1990s, the idea of techno-modernism, which didn't really supersede postmodernism. It's certainly another transformation of the modernist concept or ideology. Techno-modernism arose in the 1990s with personal computers, cell phones, social media, and the process webs of all of our electronic connections. We have a technological society that is an inescapable digital media ecosystem that we all participate in involuntarily. We could call it a cyborg dome. And these technologies undermine our democracy and our common cultural identity by providing the mechanisms for turning ideologies into personal truths that shape behavior and tribalize society. So the true shadow of spiritual democracy is this concept of secular democracy. So where does secularism come from? Secularism arose out of a movement that was originally called a religion of humanism. And it was refined into the Secular Humanist Declaration of 1980, when it was defined by three principles. It is guided by reason, it is inspired by compassion, and it is informed by experience. Secular humanism has become socialized and politicized with the idea of secular democracy, a social political environment that is not guided by religious dogma or spiritual belief. That is, the concepts of secular humanism and the concept of secular democracy are grounded in the belief of good without God. This concept relies on scientific integrity, social justice, and peace. The Humanist Manifest was written originally in 1933, and it was upgraded in 1973 and again in 2003. 1973 is the clearest version of it, and you can find it online. And so much as these ideas or principles guide American progressive neoliberalism today, some conservative critics, and I saw this in a George Will article, he used this term. He said that the problem with American liberals is that they are obsessed with the concept of the conceits of Enlightenment rationalism. And when I read the manifesto, the Humanist Manifesto of 1973, which has 17 articles in it, I could see in that the concept of the conceits of Enlightenment rationalism, which fit perfectly with Gebser's concept of the deficient mode of mental consciousness. So what you see on your screen here, I've taken out just 5 of those concepts of 5 of the articles from the Secular Humanist Manifesto. For example, knowledge is derived from observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. And in the article, it says, any account of nature should pass the test of scientific evidence. So from me, that means that insight, intuition, feelings, and imagination do not lead to understanding. Another one, ethical and moral values arise from human needs and interests tested by experience. Moral values derive from human experience. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. So I interpret that as meaning there is no metaphysical or spiritual guide to ethical or moral behavior. And pertaining to education, it says reasonable attitudes are fostered through education. Well, that means the aims of education are the transmission of knowledge, training for occupations, careers, and democratic citizenship, quote unquote, and the encouragement of moral growth, which means that educators must focus on developing the mind and intellect and not on nurturing the illusory soul. So what I think this has led to, and we just had a notion of that, the mental health crisis among children and adolescents, in fact, not just in the United States, but I think in other parts of the world, is in fact a wake-up call to the destructive effects of secular humanism, techno-modernism on our common humanity. The effects of secular modernism on youth at any one time. There are about 3 million adolescents who experience major depression, alienation in the United States, and it is a major cause of childhood suicide and mass murders by children. Statistics also show that out of an adolescent population in the United States of 25 to 30 million 13 to 15-year-olds, about 6 million of them every year contemplate suicide, and every year there are about 1 million attempted suicides with no warning behaviors. And children as young as 8 and 9 are contemplating and committing suicide. Alienation, depression leads not only to self-harm, but to rage, which is turned against society and against the schools. And in 2022, there were about 300 school shootings in the United States. In the United States, many progressives still cling to the conceits of Enlightenment rationalism and capitulate to the idea of secular democracy because they have not yet formulated that long-sought alternative of a spiritual democracy. On the other hand, conservatives in the United States have their own agenda for re-spiritualizing American society. Put up the next slide, Lisa. So conservative traditionalist nationalism wants to reverse 100 years of progressive modernism and reestablish the traditional national cultural identity of the United States. National polls reveal the unrepentant Christian nationalism appeals to about 20% of the population and about 36% of Republican voters. Under this ideology, the ideals that are to be emphasized in the school curriculum are these. I'll just mention a couple of them. Nativism is the idea that the American national identity was created by European colonists, that Native Americans, African Americans, and all other ethnic and religious groups, as well as women and children, are subservient to that ideology. And it is based on white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormative behaviors. It requires militarism because in a diverse population, the military or militarization of the police is necessary to enforce that ideological conformity. And there is a divine sanction for authoritarian control of society. That is, the traditional cultural identity is not going to be restored unless it's under an authoritarian leadership. So this has some very specific learning objectives. Are very specific learning objectives have some effect on conservative traditionalism. They have a psychological effect on the self-identity and the cultural identity formation of the individual, as you do in school. For example, the individual conscious self-identity, the ego, is formed from an interpretation of history. And we see that conflict in the media all the time now about what the history curriculum in school should be, which informs cultural identity and the sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policies that reinforce Christian nationalist cultural identity in the individual. So, Lisa, next slide, please. What we need to talk about is a spiritual democracy as an alternative to these two other possibilities, secular techno-modernism and religious nationalism. So I'm just going to give you some basic idea about spiritual democracy here and encourage you to begin to examine it and to talk about it in your community groups. And here I'm going to talk from Stephen Herman's book, William James and C.G. Jung. William James and C.G. Jung, Doorway to the Self. In chapter 13, he calls the call to vocation. The call to vocation, that vocational archetype, that monopersonality, is primary to this concept of spiritual identity, of a spiritual democracy. It says the way of individuation leads to a temporary withdrawal or separation from the known world, which is the spirit of the times, so that new self-values may be discovered. We outgrow our former selves and our sense of collective values and adopt ideals that are transmitted from the spiritual self, from the spirit of the depths to the self in society and nature. This is discovering the vocational archetype. For only then may our individuation be rightfully celebrated as new values emerge that are truly meant to transform and liberate society. Chapter 16, called Jung's Vision of Spiritual Democracy. And here he quotes from Jung. Jung says, true democracy is a highly psychological institution. And Herman comments, for Jung, spiritual democracy was a narrow doorway that led to the experience of a superior self within. That is, individuation leads to the discovery of that vocational archetype and the presentation in the personality of the monopersonality. Excuse me. In chapter 35, he talks about the religious function of spiritual democracy. Spiritual democracy is not theology. Thus, from a psychological standpoint, God is composed of many images of the self. Together, the God images of all nations make up the spiritual democracy of humanity. And that's a very fundamental point, is that spiritual democracy is universal. Spiritual democracy is wedded to the world soul. Next slide, please. So here are 8 principles that Stephen Herman outlines for us as fundamental principles of spiritual democracy. Individuation can begin with any creed, but leads to the realization of equality of all religions. is via what Jung called the objective cognition between the various God images. Thank you, Dave. We are all
that was somebody joining the thing.
We are all rooted in a common spiritual bond of cosmic relatedness to the democratic self within. This is an important one. Number 5, the projection-making factor must be quieted and projections withdrawn. That is, the outer figureheads of all religions are the same as what lies intrinsically within.
5 minutes remaining.
To be self-realized in each of us. All knowledge of the self, that is God within, is based on subjective experience. Analytical psychology differs from religious mysticism in that one does not lose ego identity in identifying with the self, and in identifying with the self or dialoguing with the shadow and the self, one must not lose ego identity and come to identify with the shadow and the self. And no one religion can resolve the problems of any one nation's cultural complexes. Next slide. So in conclusion, what I wanted to say was I wanted to present this concept of spiritual democracy as an important alternative way to look at the cultural war that is going on in the United States, but has implications throughout many societies around the world. They have this anti-democratic, authoritarian form of government that basically comes down to some form of religious nationalism, and that's only opposed by this other concept of secular humanism and techno-modernism. And the way I see it, and I believe a lot of other people do, is that these are not really the best alternatives. So spiritual democracy is in fact an alternative to both of these, and it's something that we really should begin talking about. And this is an excellent community to be able to begin to do that. Thank you.